Okay, we're going to solve some quadratics that end up having imaginary solutions. So first I'm looking at this x squared equals negative 18, and I'm thinking x squared can never equal negative 18 because when you square a number it always ends up being positive. But we're going to pretend that you can do it and just treat it like you can and just go for it and see what happens. So as I'm trying to solve a problem that says x squared equals some number, the step that you take is you square root both sides. So I'm going to square root both sides. When you do that, you have to make the other side plus or minus. So I end up getting x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 18. Okay. Once you get that as an answer, you should simplify the radical on the right. And so I'm going to split this up as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 18. This negative 1, square root of negative 1 ends up being I. And the square root of of 18, I want to split that up to the highest possible perfect square that goes into 9 times whatever it needs to get 18. And then I'm going to separate that as square root of 9 times square root of 2. And I know the square root of 9 is 3. And so I can rewrite this as x equals plus or minus 3I root 2. And that would be your solution. Okay, over here on the right, x squared plus 36 equals 0. If you were solving that, you would want to subtract 36 from both sides to get x squared by itself. And you'd probably look at that and say, oh, I know there's no solutions because x squared can't equal a negative number. But we're just doing it anyway, and we're going to get imaginary solutions. So the next step to get rid of the squared is to square root both sides. When you square root both sides, you have to remember to do plus or minus. We're then left with x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 36. Well, we could split that up to negative 1 times 36. And the square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 36 is 6. And so our answer would be x equals plus or minus 6i. Okay, and lastly down here, something else a little different with a 3 in front maybe. The first step would be to go ahead and divide both sides by 3 because we want to get that x squared by itself in order to solve the quadratic. So we've got the x squared by itself. It's now equal to negative 27. To solve this, we would take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. Okay, then as we're trying to simplify this, we would split this up to negative 1 times 27. So we can get x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 27. The square root of negative 1 is I. And the square root of 27, if we want to simplify that radical, we need to think of the largest perfect square that goes into 27. And the largest perfect square that goes into 27 is 9. So this would end up being x equals plus or minus I times the square root of 9 times 3. Let's come up here. This would be x equals plus or minus I times, now I can split that 9 and 3 up to the square root of 9 times the square root of 3. I know the square root of 9 is 3, so my answer then is x equals plus or minus 3I root 3. And that's in simplest radical form.